I never told my daughter that the office I went to every morning for 30 years was a building I actually owned. To her, I was just a man who wore a faded uniform and came home with calloused hands. But when her fiancé's family invited me to their estate, I decided to see if they loved my daughter for who she was, or if they only respected people who shouted their net worth from the rooftops. What happened that afternoon at the Hunter estate devastated Antonio and Vicky in a way they never imagined. And trust me, they deserved every bit of it. Let me explain who I really am. Before we go into details, click subscribe, like, and comment where you're watching from. I would be glad to know this story goes as far as Canada, all of the United States of America, Australia, Africa, and even the United Kingdom. So let me know where you're listening from. My name is Roy M. Rivera. To the world of venture capital, I am a ghost, the silent hand behind the city's largest acquisitions. But to my daughter, Cindy, I'm just a retired janitor who likes his 2-0-year-old mattress more than a 5-star hotel. I've always believed that true power doesn't shout, true power observes. I lived in a modest house, wore discount clothes, and kept my billions hidden behind a veil of silence. Why? Because I wanted Cindy to grow up knowing that a person's value isn't found in a bank statement. But that Tuesday, everything changed. Cindy called me, her voice trembling with a cocktail of excitement and fear. "Dad, Robert's parents, Antonio and Vicky, are hosting a luncheon. They're very particular. Dad, please, just try to blend in." I heard the underlying message, "Please don't embarrass me." It wasn't the voice of a daughter. It was the voice of someone apologizing for a father they thought was simple. That was the moment I decided, if the Hunters wanted a poor, naive laborer to look down on, I would give them exactly what they expected. I would wear the uniform. I would play the part. I wanted to see their true faces before they became my family. Because my instinct, the one that helped me build an empire, told me that beneath their designer silk, the Hunters were sharks. The world at 4 a.m. doesn't care about your bank account. It only cares about your discipline. I woke up in a room so minimalist it bordered on monastic white walls, a single wooden chair, and a mattress I've refused to replace for 20 years. To anyone looking in, I was a man one step away from the breadline. But as I pressed my thumb against a hidden biometric scanner disguised as a knot in the floorboards, a section of the wall slid back to reveal a glowing bank of monitors that controlled the pulse of the global market. I watched in silence as 3 of my offshore hedge funds executed a maneuver that wiped $40 million off a competitor's valuation before the sun even hit the horizon. My pulse didn't even quicken. In this room, I was a god. I was the silent hand that moved the chess pieces of empires. I knew the truth, that the desperate and the greedy always forgot. The loudest man in the room is usually the one with the most to lose. Real power doesn't need to bark. It simply exists. But as the clock struck 5, the Titan retreated. I shut down the monitors, the hum of high-stakes finance replaced by the heavy silence of my secret life. I reached into the closet and pulled out a navy work shirt, its collar frayed and its fabric smelling of cheap detergent. I ran my fingers over the Rivera patch, my disguise, my armor, and my greatest lie. My daughter, Cindy, believed this uniform was the reason I couldn't afford to take her to the fancy restaurants her fiancé's family frequented. She didn't know that I could buy every restaurant in this city and still have enough left to buy the land they sat on. I walked to the kitchen, brewing a cup of bitter, low-grade coffee, forcing myself to inhabit the skin of a man who struggled. It was a game I played to protect her, to ensure she found a man who loved her soul and not my portfolio. But today, the game felt dangerous. I picked up my phone to see a frantic text from Cindy. "Dad, please don't be late. Antonio Hunter is already asking about your professional background. He's looking for a reason to cancel the wedding. Please, just don't let him see who we really are." I stared at the screen, my grip tightening until the glass groaned. She thought I was the liability. She thought the janitor's uniform was the secret that would ruin her. I caught my reflection in the darkened window, a billionaire dressed as a beggar, heading into a lion's den, where the lions didn't realize they were already in my cage. But as I stepped toward the door, my private security line buzzed with a priority red alert. My lead analyst's voice was a jagged whisper. "Sir, we have a problem. Someone just bypassed the firewall on the Rivera Trust. They aren't looking for money, they're looking for your location, and they're already at the Hunter estate." The knock on my door wasn't the rhythmic, confident rap of a woman in love. It was the frantic, uneven staccato of someone drowning. When I opened it, Cindy didn't even say hello. She paced my small, cramped living room, her fingers obsessively twisting the modest gold band on her left finger until the skin turned a raw, angry red. The pale morning light caught the cheap glass of the ring, a stone Robert had bought, with 3 months of middle-class savings, and for a second I felt a flash of murderous rage toward the Hunter family. They were already making her feel small, and the lunch hadn't even started. "Dad, you have to listen to me," she whispered, her voice cracking as she stared at my scuffed linoleum floor. "Antonio, he isn't like us. He measures the world in square footage and mahogany. To him, people are just balance sheets. If he sees you in that—" She gestured vaguely at my frayed workshirt, her eyes filling with a shimmering, desperate heat. "He'll dismantle Robert. He'll cut him off. He told Robert last night that pedigree is the only collateral that matters in this family." I sat on the edge of my worn-out sofa, leaning forward with the practiced, heavy slouch of a man who had spent 40 years scrubbing floors. I let my hands that had signed billion-dollar mergers in glass towers, rest heavily on my knees. "Cindy, it's just a lunch. If he's a good man, he'll see you're happy. He doesn't care about happy, Dad. He cares about the Hunter legacy," she snapped, her escalation hitting a fever pitch. "He's already looking for a reason to snap the leash. He mentioned your name to his private investigators, Dad. He's digging. He's looking for the dirt under your fingernails to prove we aren't their kind of people." I maintained my hollow, naive expression, but internally my mind was a cold, high-speed processor. I mentally pulled up the dossier I'd reviewed at 4 a.m. Antonio Hunter's firm, Hunter Capital, was bleeding. They had over-leveraged on a failed biotech acquisition and were currently 48 hours away from a liquidity crisis that would erase their name from the skyline. He wasn't royalty. He was a scavenger in a 3-piece suit, desperately looking for a wealthy merger via his son to stay afloat. "I'll be on my best behavior, honey," I said, my voice like gravel. "Best behavior isn't enough." She grabbed my shoulders, her desperation a physical weight in the small room. "If he smells poverty, he'll destroy Robert's career before the dessert arrives. Promise me, Dad. Promise me you won't mention the union, or the overtime, or the—" She stopped abruptly as my burner phone, the one I kept for emergencies, began to vibrate with a violent, rhythmic hum. It wasn't the analyst. It was an encrypted text from an unknown source. My heart skipped a beat as I glanced at the screen. It was a photo taken from a high-angle long lens. It was a picture of Cindy and me through my own living room window, taken 10 seconds ago. Beneath the image was a single line of text. "The janitor has a beautiful daughter. It would be a shame if Antonio found out she's the heir to the Rivera throne before you're ready to pay the ransom." Cindy's eyes drifted toward the phone, her hand reaching out. "Who is that, Dad? Why do you look like you've seen a ghost?" I slid the phone into my pocket, the screen still burning with the image of us taken from the shadows. My daughter's hand hovered inches from the device, her face a mask of confusion. But I caught her wrist with a grip that was too firm, too disciplined for a simple laborer. For a split second, the titan slipped through the cracks of the janitor's mask. I saw her flinch, and I immediately softened my touch, forcing a weary, crooked smile that didn't reach my eyes. "Just a telemarketer, honey. They never stop, do they?" I lied, the words tasting like ash. I ushered her out with a promise to meet her at the Hunter estate in an hour, but the moment the door clicked shut, the air in the room turned frigid. I didn't reach for my phone to call security. If someone had bypassed my encryption and was sitting in a sniper's nest outside my window, a phone call was a death sentence. Instead, I walked to the closet and pulled out the navy work shirt. It was heavy, smelling of industrial soap and the ghosts of a harder life. I buttoned it up, my fingers moving with a mechanical precision, each button a seal on my true identity. I smoothed out the Rivera patch over my heart, a name that meant nothing to the world in this font, but meant everything in a boardroom. I didn't take my private car. I called a yellow cab, the kind that rattled and smelled of stale tobacco. As we drove, I watched the world transform through the cracked window. We bled out of the grey, industrial veins of the city, where the smoke from the factories choked the sky, and into the lush, pale-toned silence of the North Hills. Here, the grass was a manicured, unnatural emerald, and the gates weren't built to keep people out. They were built to remind you that you didn't belong. The taxi driver kept glancing at me in the rear-view mirror, his lip curling at my faded uniform. "You lost, pal? Maintenance entrance is 3 miles back." "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be," I muttered, my eyes fixed on the Hunter mansion looming ahead like a white marble tomb. The stakes weren't just about a wedding anymore. Someone knew who I was. Someone was playing a game with my daughter's life as the ante, and they were using Antonio Hunter's arrogance as the perfect smokescreen. As the cab pulled up to the towering iron gates, the guard didn't even check my ID. He just sneered and pointed toward the service road. But as I stepped out of the car, my phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't a text. It was a live video feed. It showed the interior of the Hunter dining room. I saw Cindy sitting at the long table, looking small and terrified, and then the camera panned to the seat directly behind her. A man in a waiter's jacket was leaning in, whispering something into her ear that made her face go bone white. He looked up directly into the camera lens and winked. I wasn't just walking into a lunch with elitists. I was walking into a kill zone. The iron gates of the Hunter estate didn't just open, they hissed, a sound like a guillotine blade sliding into place. As I walked the long, crunching gravel path toward the white marble monolith, every step in my scuffed work boots felt like a provocation against the silence of the elite. The doorman, a man in a livery so crisp it looked like armor, didn't just block the entrance. He recoiled. His eyes raked over my faded navy shirt and the Rivera patch, with the kind of visceral loathing usually reserved for a biohazard. "The maintenance entrance is a half-mile back. Laborer," he spat, his voice trembling with the insult of my presence. "I'm the father of the bride," I said, my voice low and vibrating with a power he couldn't name. I stared him down until his composure cracked, and he stepped aside with a sneer that promised retribution. Inside, the mansion was a desert of pale tones and surgical lighting, a space designed to make anyone with a soul feel like a stain. Antonio and Vicky were perched on a white leather sofa that looked more like a throne than furniture. They didn't stand. They didn't even lean forward. They watched me approach with the clinical, bored detachment of gods looking at an insect. Cindy was there, perched on the edge of a chair, her face a mask of waxen terror. Her eyes darted toward the man in the waiter's jacket, the infiltrator from the video, who was now pouring wine with a chilling, mechanical grace behind Antonio. "So, this is the patriarch," Antonio said, his voice dripping with practiced, oily condescension. He didn't offer a hand. Instead, he gestured vaguely toward a low, wooden stool tucked into the deep shadows of a mahogany pillar, far from the warmth of the center rug. "Sit there, Rivera. We wouldn't want the industrial grease from your daily struggle to ruin the upholstery." It's Italian, you understand. The humiliation was a physical weight, a calculated attempt to relegate me to the status of a servant in front of my own daughter. I sat, my knees high, my presence marginalized into the dark corner. Cindy's hands were shaking so violently she had to clench them into fists beneath the table. But as Antonio leaned back to begin his interrogation, I felt a sharp, rhythmic vibration against my thigh. I reached into the pocket of my work pants and felt a cold, jagged piece of metal that hadn't been there a minute ago. I looked down, shielding the movement with the shadow of the pillar. Taped to the underside of the wooden stool was a small, high-frequency detonator with a digital countdown glowing in a lethal neon red. Lingden Sishawufen. The waiter leaned over Antonio's shoulder to adjust a fork, his voice a smooth, deadly purr that reached only my ears. I hope you're as good at diffusing situations as you are at scrubbing floors, Roy, because if you stand up, this entire wing levels. If you stay silent, I kill Cindy first. Your move, Titan. The dining room felt like a glass cage, pressurized and ready to shatter. The air smelled of expensive lilies and the metallic tang of fear as the waiter moved with ghostly precision, placing a single, gold-flaked scallop before me. It was a mockery of a meal, a tiny portion served on a plate that cost more than my supposed monthly rent. I sat on my wooden stool, relegated to the periphery, while Antonio Hunter swirled a vintage Bordeaux that glowed like a bruised ruby in the light of the crystal chandelier. "So, Roy," Antonio began, his voice a sharp blade wrapped in velvet. He didn't look at me. He looked at his own reflection in a polished silver spoon. "Cindy tells us you've spent your life in manual labor. Admirable, in a quaint, industrial sort of way. But let's be pragmatic. My son is a rising star. My daughter-in-law must be an asset, not a liability. Tell me about your retirement plan. What exactly do you bring to the table besides, well, your absence?" I lowered my gaze, hunching my shoulders, until the Rivera patch on my chest looked like a badge of defeat. I let my hands tremble slightly as I gripped the silver fork. "I try to be careful, sir," I said, my voice thin and fragile, the perfect imitation of a man who had been told he was nothing for far too long. "I've been saving pennies in a jar for years. I just hope the roof doesn't leak this winter. Most of my check goes to the union fees and the bus pass. I don't want to be a burden." Vicky let out a sharp, melodic laugh that sounded like breaking glass. She leaned toward her husband, her pearls clinking against the table. "It's practically Dickensian, isn't it? I wonder, Roy, if you expect us to provide a wardrobe for the wedding. We have a reputation to maintain." Antonio smirked, the disdain in the room becoming a suffocating fog. "We value pedigree here, Roy, but pedigree requires maintenance. I'm beginning to think your very existence is a threat to my son's social standing. A man who counts pennies shouldn't be sitting at a table where the wine costs $1,000 a bottle." I glanced at Cindy. She was deathly pale, her eyes pleading with me to say something, anything to defend our dignity. But my eyes were locked on the waiter. He wasn't pouring wine anymore. He was standing directly behind Cindy, his hand resting lightly, possessively, on the back of her chair. In his other hand, he held a small, black device with a single toggle switch. He caught my stare and slowly, mockingly, moved his thumb. The digital display beneath my stool emitted a high-pitched, steady whine that made my teeth ache. The countdown had hit 03, and the red light was no longer flashing. It was a solid, angry crimson. "Actually, Antonio," I said, my voice suddenly dropping 2 octaves into a cold, terrifying bass that silenced the room. "You're right. A man who counts pennies has no place here, but a man who counts losses, well, he's exactly what you need to worry about." Suddenly, my high-tech terminal in my pocket let out a piercing override tone. A message flashed on my retina display contact lens. Perimeter breached. Unknown assets on site. Outside, the distant, rhythmic thump of a blacked-out helicopter began to vibrate the floorboards, and the waiter's thumb slammed down on the trigger. The vibration of the helicopter outside rattled the crystal decanters on the sideboard, but Antonio Hunter didn't flinch. He simply stood, his face a mask of cold, aristocratic calculation. "A word, Rivera." "In private," he commanded, his voice slicing through the thick tension. He didn't wait for a response. He led me away from the dining room, away from Cindy's panicked eyes, and the waiter, whose thumb remained poised over the trigger. We entered a study that felt like a tomb of unread wisdom. The walls were lined with thousands of leather-bound books, their gold-leaf spines gleaming under recessed lights, but there wasn't a single crease in their bindings. Antonio didn't offer me a chair. He didn't offer me a drink. He walked behind a massive desk of petrified oak and looked at me as if I were a grease stain on a masterpiece. "Let's stop the theater, Roy," he began, his voice dropping into a low, predatory growl. "I've seen your savings. I've smelled the detergent on that pathetic uniform. My son is a hunter. He is destined for the boardrooms of the world, not the breakrooms of the working class. You are a ghost, from a past we are currently exorcising." He reached into a drawer and pulled out a leather checkbook. With a flourish of a gold-nibbed pen, he scribbled a number that he clearly thought would change my life. He slid the slip of paper across the desk. It was for $50,000. "Take it," Antonio said, leaning back with a smirk of absolute superiority. "Move back to whatever hole you crawled out of. Buy a new roof. Buy a dozen new uniforms. Just stay away from the wedding. We'll tell Cindy you had a sudden work emergency. A man like you know how to vanish, don't you?" I looked down at the check, my heart hammering against my ribs, not with greed, but with a cold, surging fury. The stakes had reached their zenith. He wasn't just buying my absence. He was trying to delete my daughter's heritage. 50,000, I whispered, playing the part one last time, my voice trembling with feigned shock. That's more than I make in 3 years. It's a generous exit fee for a janitor," Antonio sneered, his eyes darting to the clock. He was desperate to close the deal before his firm's liquidation hit the news. Sign the NDA on the back and walk out the service door. Now. I picked up the check, my fingers brushing the edge of the desk where I felt the cold, hard casing of the signal jammer I'd planted earlier. Suddenly, the lights in the study flickered and turned a deep, blood red. The heavy oak door behind me locked with an electronic click that echoed like a gunshot. My phone didn't just buzz, it screamed a high-priority alert. I glanced at the screen. It was a live feed of the Hunter Estate's mainframe. A red progress bar was at 99%. Beneath it, a message from my head of security appeared. "Identity compromised. The waiter isn't a kidnapper, he's a corporate assassin hired by your own board. And he just sent the cleaner to the study." The sound of the vents overhead hissed, and a faint, sweet smell began to fill the room. Antonio's eyes widened as he realized the air was being poisoned. "What is this? What have you done?" He gasped, reaching for the phone. I stood up straight, the slouch of the janitor vanishing as I tore the $50,000 check in half. "That check wouldn't even cover the tip at the dinner where I'm firing you, Antonio," I said, my voice now a terrifying, resonant roar. "But we have a bigger problem. The man in the hallway doesn't care about your money. He's here to make sure neither of us leaves this room alive." I picked up the $50,000 check with 2 fingers, holding it like a piece of contaminated waste. For a long, agonizing moment, I let the silence in the study thicken until the only sound was Antonio's shallow, expectant breathing. Then, slowly, the corners of my mouth curled into a cold, surgical smile. The slumped shoulders of the janitor vanished. The weary, dim light in my eyes was replaced by a predatory flash that made Antonio stumble back against his petrified oak desk. "You really should have done your due diligence, Antonio," I said. My voice didn't tremble anymore. It was a resonant, terrifying baritone that seemed to vibrate the very glass in the windows. I stood at my full height, my presence suddenly so massive, so authoritative, that the expensive leather-bound room felt like a claustrophobic cage. I pulled a sleek, titanium-cased encrypted phone from the hidden pocket of my work pants, a device that cost more than the car Antonio had used to pick up my daughter. I tapped the screen, and the blood-red emergency lights of the study synced to the device, pulsing in time with my heartbeat. You've spent 6 months begging for a meeting with M. Rivera to save your failing legacy, I continued, stepping into his personal space. You sent 36 emails to my chief of staff, offering 20% of your firm just for a 5-minute phone call. Well, Antonio, look at me. You finally got your meeting. Antonio's face went from arrogant to ashen in a heartbeat. His jaw worked silently, his eyes darting from my frayed Rivera patch to the glowing executive terminal in my hand. Rivera? No, you're a laborer. You're a nobody. You're a janitor. I own the building you call an office, Antonio. I own the debt that is currently crushing your throat. And as of 30 seconds ago, I leaned in, my voice a jagged whisper. I own the $50,000 check you just tried to bribe me with. Consider it a down payment on your bankruptcy. The escalation hit a fever pitch as my phone let out a rhythmic, high-frequency pulse. The screen displayed a global markets heat map. Every one of Antonio's assets was turning a terminal shade of black. He collapsed into his chair, clutching his chest, the sweet, poisoned air from the vents making his eyes bloodshot. Please, Roy, my family. To Robert. Robert is a better man than you'll ever be, I growled. But he's currently in a room with a man who was sent to kill us both. Suddenly, the heavy mahogany door didn't just rattle. It groaned under the force of a hydraulic ram. The wood began to splinter, and the waiter's voice drifted through the cracks, no longer polite, but distorted by a tactical respirator. Change of plans, Mr. Rivera. The board doesn't want a merger anymore. They want an inheritance, and since your daughter is the only legal heir. A horrific scream from the dining room, Cindy's scream cut through the air, followed by the deafening, rhythmic shatter of the floor-to-ceiling glass windows. My heart stopped. The cleaner wasn't coming for me. He had already found her. The scream from the dining room ignited a cold, lethal fire in my veins. Antonio was shaking, his hands clawing at the edge of his mahogany desk as his world turned to ash. I didn't move toward the door. I moved toward him. I grabbed the $50,000 check, that insulting scrap of paper, and shredded it slowly, the sound like a bone snapping in the sudden, heavy silence of the room. You spent 6 months begging my firm for a lifeline, Antonio, I growled, my voice a resonant boom that seemed to rattle the unread books on the shelves. You sent desperate, late-night emails to M. Rivera, pleading for a merger that would stop the banks from seizing this very house. You thought I was a ghost. You thought I was a savior. But I'm just the man who sat on your wooden stool while you spat on my name. I slammed my encrypted phone onto the desk, the screen projecting a holographic display of Hunter Capital's real-time valuation. The numbers were cascading in a vertical drop, a digital massacre. I came here today wearing this uniform to see if you were worth my investment. I wanted to see if the man my daughter was joining her life to had a father with a shred of integrity. You failed the test within 10 minutes, Antonio. You aren't a titan. You're a parasite in a tailored suit. Roy, please, he wheezed, his face a ghostly, translucent white. The firm, my legacy. I'll do anything. I'll apologize to Cindy. It's too late for apologies, I snapped, my thumb hovering over a final, black command on the screen. As of this second, the Rivera Trust is officially withdrawing all support. I'm shorting your stock into the earth. By tomorrow morning, the Hunter name will be a case study in corporate arrogance. You aren't just broke, Antonio. You're extinct. I hit the button, A low, electronic hum vibrated through the floorboards, and the holographic display vanished into a single, blinking line of text. Partnership terminated. Antonio collapsed back into his chair, his eyes glazed with the shock of a man who had just watched his entire history be erased by a janitor. But the victory was hollow. Another scream, sharper and more desperate than the last, tore through the mansion. The waiter, the assassin, wasn't waiting for the board's signal anymore. The heavy mahogany door to the study suddenly hissed, the electronic locks overriding from the outside. The door didn't open. It was blown off its hinges by a precision thermite charge. Through the smoke, I saw the tactical boots of a man who didn't care about my billions. He stepped over the debris, his respirator glowing in the red emergency light. He wasn't looking at Antonio. He was dragging a bound and gagged Cindy by the arm, a jagged combat knife pressed against her throat. "The board sends their regards, Mr. Rivera," he rasped, his voice distorted by the mask. "They said if you won't sign the merger, your heir will sign your death warrant." He didn't wait for a negotiation. He kicked Cindy toward me and raised a suppressed pistol, his finger tightening on the trigger as the red dot settled right between my eyes. The red dot of the suppressed pistol danced on my forehead, a laser-guided death sentence. Behind the assassin, the study door was a jagged hole of splintered mahogany and rising smoke. Cindy was on her knees, her eyes wide with a terror that no amount of my hidden billions could ever soothe. But then, the air in the room shifted. A shadow eclipsed the hallway light. Robert burst through the debris, his face contorted in a primal, protective rage I hadn't expected from a man raised in country clubs. He didn't hesitate. He tackled the assassin from the side, just as the muffled thwip of a bullet tore through the air, grazing the leather-bound books inches from my ear. They crashed into Antonio's desk, the mahogany groaning under the weight of the struggle. Robert wasn't a fighter, but he fought like a man who had finally seen the rot in his own bloodline and was determined to cut it out. "Robert, stop!" Antonio screamed from his chair, his voice a pathetic, high-pitched wail. "He's working for the board. If you touch him, we lose everything. Think of the firm." Robert froze, his hands locked around the assassin's throat. He looked at his father, the man who had just tried to sell his fiancée's soul for a $50,000 bribe, and his expression hardened into something cold and final. "The firm is dead, Dad," Robert spat, his voice trembling with a lethal clarity. "And after what you just did, so is this family." He shoved the stunned assassin away, grabbing Cindy and pulling her to her feet. He stood between us and his father, a human shield against the elitism that had defined his life. In that moment, the janitor died inside me. I stood tall, the titan finally shedding the skin of the laborer. I didn't need a gun. I had the power of 1,000 boardrooms in my gaze. "We're leaving," I said, my voice a resonant boom that made the assassin hesitate. "Antonio, enjoy your empty house. By dawn, the banks will be changing the locks. You chose capital over character. Now, you have neither." We walked out of the study, stepping over the shredded remains of my poverty and the shattered glass of the hunter's false prestige. As we reached the towering iron gates, the morning sun began to bleed over the horizon, casting long, cinematic shadows across the gravel. I looked at Robert, who was holding Cindy's hand as if it were the only anchor left in a world that had just ended. I had lost a business partner, but I had gained a son-in-law who valued a woman more than a bank statement. But as we reached my waiting black sedan, the one I had finally summoned to end the charade, my lead security detail stepped out, his face ghostly pale. He didn't open the door. He held up a tablet showing a live feed of my hidden vault, the one beneath my modest apartment. The vault door was wide open. The masterpieces were gone. The high-tech terminals were dark, and painted in blood across the center wall was a single, cryptic message that made my heart stop. "The test wasn't for Antonio, Roy. The test was for you. And while you were playing janitor at the mansion, We were taking back the empire. Thank you for sticking around with me, my wonderful story family. If you enjoyed the story, click subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from, because tomorrow I will be giving you another story just as interesting as this one, and you don't want to miss it.